Okay, so like I said, today we're going to be talking about chapter 4 from Murray's book, which is about the use of the demonstrative and the nominative and the genitive case. But we're also going to talk about cases more generally, actually, which I believe comes from either 5 or 7. And we'll also be talking about verbs, taking a look at them. And so this is it as well. Oh yes, I know what it is. A dative and accusative show up in chapter 5, but they also show up as prepositional objects in chapter 7. And I'm going to talk a bit about that as well. We're not really going to deal with the neuter and feminine demonstrative part, because that's actually something we more or less covered last time, where we talked about case and gender across all the paradigms. And really in this chapter, that bit, he's explaining to you how you can translate by phrase, and it's less ambiguous if you're looking at the noun phrase as a whole than it is if you're only looking at the noun. But I know that all of the tutorial groups really emphasized that last week as well. Okay, so I find this personally not very difficult. And I never have found it that difficult. So if this is difficult, don't be afraid to say it. You know, Shakuna Sagu, or however you say that. You can't really tell what's going to be easy or not. But the main thing is that Old English doesn't have articles the way that we do in modern English. It uses these demonstratives, s and thes, and it also has numerals and sort of determiner type pronoun-y things that can be used as determiners to point at nouns. But the big difference is they tend to be really used with the full meaning. So the difference is in modern English, we have the, which is fairly neutral, but pointing out a specific instance of a noun. And then we have a, which is talking about a general case. And then we have this and that, which is talking very specifically, often contrastedly, about specific instances of nouns. And in Old English, they kind of bunch those all together. They use "se" as a way, and less commonly "thes," as a way of pointing out specific instances, also doing it contrastively. They do use "a" or "an" and "some," in sort of the way we do in modern English, except as a rule, and this is true of a lot of things in Old English, they mean it with the full lexical meaning of that. So when we say "a car," we mean not one in particular, I'm just talking about a car. But in Old English, if they say "an car," first of all, that'd be quite exceptional of them. But what we would imagine they meant is a single car. They mean one. And if they say, you know, some cars, they mean a collection of them in some way. So that means they tend to be a little bit stronger than we'd use them. As I say, it often means approximately the, but it's very commonly got a stronger sense of this or that. But there's two other things about "se" that are, I think, really interesting always. And one of them is that "se" can be used as a pronoun. And it's a little bit like German, where the thing that is the article, der, in the nominative masculine singular, can also be used instead of the equivalent of he. And the same is true of Old English. So I made up a sentence there. Beowulf is Herr, se is König. Se is König. That one, really he. It doesn't have a very strong sense of I'm choosing him out. And then finally, it can also be used in relatives. And this is actually going to come up in the first reading twice in the life of Jesus. And I actually should have put these in here. It can be used in a variety of ways for relatives. So I've got it here with the. That's very common. The two examples we're going to see in the next reading in the birth of Jesus, they're actually only going to be using "se" without the "the," and it can also serve as a relative. You'll see early on there's the city of David. Seo is Bethlehem, I think it says. And so what's going on there is it's basically saying in the city of David, the one that is Beowulf, or the one that is Bethlehem, or something like that. And then later on, there's another one where they've got So, and I can't remember who the antecedent is for that. So it can be used as a relative, like who or which or that. And as I say here, I think those are probably the two hardest things to get used to. Next up is case in that chapter, and we've already established that there's a basic connection between case and function. And if you have to learn one thing, and I'm going to, and the test this week tests you on this, it is that nominative is the case that is used for the subject function. Accusative is the case that's used for direct object function. Genitive is the case that's used for possession. Dative is this by with two for, as I call it, some kind of oblique interest. And the instrumental, to the degree that we ever see it, is a specific case of oblique interest, either by or with. And so this is the most important thing to know about the cases. This is what they mostly do, and that's why we're really interested in them. But a refined aspect of language use in Old English is that the cases can be used for more than that. And that's also true of modern English. And in fact, here I've focused on how we use the cases in modern English, actually in a subtle way as well. So one use is as the subject, obviously, for the nominative, but another is the vocative. And vocative means the one you call out to people at. In some languages, they have a separate case for that. So you might say, oh, Susie, go to the bank. And in Latin, for example, they have a vocative case. That's the calling case. But in Old English, they use the nominative for that. And so you might even be able to say, go to the bank, you. You might be able to use thu there. Genitive, obvious case is what we translate with apostrophe S or S apostrophe, Susie's wallet. But it has a couple of other interesting ones, and in fact, you're going to see a lot of them coming up. So you can have interest, benefit, origin. This first example for the love of Susie or for Susie's sake. These are sometimes known as, the distinction is actually known as the objective or subjective genitive. So you've got, for instance, the classic example they always use is the love of the father. What does that mean? Is it father's love or is it love for the father? And the answer is genitive can cover both of those occurrences. So for the love of Susie means for the benefit of the love of Susie, in the interest in some kind of connection to the love of Susie. Captain of the team, the team's captain. Sure, there's kind of, it feels a little bit possessive-y there, but there's also really it's some kind of benefit or interest relationship. Same's true of the dog's bite, right? Yeah, I guess you could say it's a possessive, that when the dog bites your leg, the act of biting belonged to the dog or something. But we tend to think of that then as some kind of benefit, origin, connection, and genitive's used a lot for that. Two that Murray doesn't mention, he actually mentions the bottom one, but one he doesn't mention, but it's one of my favorites, is genitive is used of habitual time. And the reason why I love that one is because that's also true today in modern English. And so I've given you an example there. Tuesdays, I like to go out. That Tuesdays isn't plural. That Tuesdays is actually a genitive. It means of a Tuesday, I like to go out. And you can even hear that there. I can say it that way. Of a Tuesday, there's that other way of making genitives or the equivalent of genitives in English, shows you that it's really that connection, interest, benefit, origin sort of relationship. So Anglo-Saxons use it that way. They use it for habitual time. And then another one that's my favorite is the partitive genitive. And we also use this all the time. If you're talking about a piece taken out of something else, the partition of something, or extraction of something, you use the genitive case as well. We do the same thing. Murray, in his chapter, says, he gives the example of fela, which is an indeclinable word meaning many, and then you almost always see that with a genitive plural. It can also be on its own, but you see it with the genitive plural. And he says you just have to learn that it's an idiom. And it's true with many. We don't generally use an of construction or a genitive construction. Might be able to, but we generally don't. But we certainly say many of them, or 6 cups of coffee, or 6 cups of rice. And those are examples of partitive genitives, right? As you can see, and I've mentioned this in tutorial and I think in the lecture as well, I generally recommend when you're translating genitives, use what I call the de form, which is the French version of that. It's our construction with of, which is what's known as a calque on the French construction de. And I like using that because you can actually use them pretty much interchangeably, the apostrophe S versus the of form, not equally idiomatically, but they generally fit in context. But the of form actually has a closer connection, and the range in which we can use the of construction is more closely parallel to the range in which the Old English uses the genitive. And so I always recommend translating them as ofs, even for possessions. So, you know, Dan's book, the book of Dan, I realize in Old English, in modern English, that means something slightly different. But as a rule, it's worthwhile getting used to translating them using of. Whoops. So the other two cases that we really want to talk about, the instrumental is just not that important really, are the accusative and the dative. And the accusative is used for direct objects of verbs. Direct objects of verbs are things that answer the question what, for verbs that then you have to do something to something. So, you know, you hit nails, so nail would be the direct object. In Old English, you'd use the accusative for that. And then some prepositions take an accusative object. Either they normally do or they can do it. And I've given you an example here to show. So in, the preposition in can take either a dative or an accusative object. And there's a slight difference in meaning in the sense that accusative has a sense of motion into or motion towards. And so if they say in facestre, accusative, then they're meaning into the castle, from the outside going in. Whereas if they say in fata, well, it's not a great example because it would look the same, but let's say, I don't know, stone, in tham stana, then that means you're stuck inside the stone. So I guess that would be the difference. When King Arthur gets the stone, or I guess when they were setting it up for King Arthur, what they had to say was put the sword in the stone. And so they said, sword in thana stan. Put the sword into the stone. And then when they saw King Arthur and they invited him over to try pulling it out, they said, hey, King Arthur, look, there's a sword in the stone. And then they said, sword in tham stana. And then, of course, King Arthur pulled it back out. So I guess he pulled the sword from, I'm going to say Thonastana, I think. Thonistan. I think he pulled it out of the stone. I'm not 100% sure about that one. Anyway, so accusative can be used with some prepositions, just naturally that's what they belong together. But if you have a choice, it tends to have a sense of motion to it. And then the last one is datives. And datives are used for oblique relationships. Generally, a really good way of thinking of it is as indirect objects. But again, some kind of benefit, interest, origin, some kind of connection. So one example would be, she passed Kelly the puck. Kelly in Old English would be in the dative because she's the indirect object of that, right? Kelly is the indirect object. She passed the puck to Kelly, right? And you can see in modern English, we would put in the oblique form of she. We'd put in her there. A really cool one, we don't do it so often anymore, but right up to Shakespeare's time, is the use of what in Renaissance studies is known as the ethical dative. See it all the time in Shakespeare, where he'll do something like, kill me some Romans. He can use me, as a kind of reflexive in a way that we can't. Or at least not unless we're being archaic. But that's known as an ethical dative if you're in Renaissance studies. It's really a kind of dative of benefit or something. Pour me a beer, there's another example. You're not really the indirect object there, you're the beneficiary. I guess unless you don't like beer, in which case you're the victim. Tell me a story, right? There's another one. Not really indirect object, more a kind of sense of beneficiary. They can use this a fair bit more than we can. although probably about the same as Shakespeare can. And then, as I said, probably the other places, if I had to guess, I'd say the dative is far more common as a prepositional object than the accusative is. So you see it very often as a prepositional object. And that's really it for the cases. So basically, the thing I'm going to go back here actually, if I can, yeah. Whoops. So the way to think of this is really, really know the chart that you're seeing right here, which is the relationship between case and function, because this is the bread and butter of what we're working with. But whenever there's trouble, whenever you're reading something, you're going, wait a second, I don't understand what that has to do. It's almost certainly one of these other uses that, so, you know, once you're going, wait a second, there's a genitive here and I can't see them possessing anything. It's almost certainly got to do something to do with benefit or interest. Whenever you see there's a dative there and you're wondering what on earth they're doing there, it's almost certainly some kind of ethical dative, some kind of indication of benefit. So this is really your go-to whenever there's trouble. And that's really it for the cases. I think the only way of really learning this is by practice. After you've had a little bit of practice at it, it becomes second nature. And I don't even remember really having to learn this. Except that I know I did so bad in cases in first year Latin, I must have had to learn it. Okay, I was going to do the reading passages, but I think I'll come back to those and talk about verb paradigms instead first. But has anybody got any questions about the use of cases? Okay, as I said, this material there came from chapters 4, 5, and 7 on cases. The accusative and dative stuff came from 5 and 7, and the nominative and genitive stuff came from 4. All right, so then let's talk about verb paradigms for a second. In modern English, we don't have very many forms of our verbs. They're really minimal paradigms. And so we have some inflections. We've got strong versus weak versus irregular. And as always, I recommend that you get one example that you know is absolutely belongs to each class. So I always use drive and love as my strong and weak, because they do exactly what you want them to do. So drive is an example of a strong verb. Love is an example of a weak verb. And be is an example of an irregular verb. The difference, of course, is drive changes by changing its vowel. So I drive, I drove, I was driven. And love changes by adding ed to change tense. I love, I loved, I was loved. We also have tens. We mark for tens. So we've got I go, I went. I drive, I drove. I love, I loved. We sort of have mood. There's some vestiges of mood. Well, we have imperative, but there's some subjunctive shows up, usually in fossilized phrases like fee, fi, fo, fum, I spill the blood of an Englishman, be he rich or be he poor, shows up there. If I were you, in many people's dialect, is an example of a real subjunctive. And you can compare that to if I was you. I'm pretty sure, growing up in Toronto, I'm pretty sure I say if I was you. But out here, I'm pretty sure we say if I were you. And if you think about that, where's that were coming from? Because I was, sure, it's you were, but that's in the past tense. And if I were you is not in the past tense. What's actually going on there is that's a contrary to fact statement, and you're using an actual subjunctive there. Were I to drive to Calgary, there's an example. You can really hear that subjunctive there because, first of all, the very sentence, you know, the second half of that sentence is, but I didn't, and I'm not going to. And secondly, there's no form other than the subjunctive in which the form that goes with I was were, right? It would have to be, if it was past, was I going to Calgary? And people say, don't ask me, you can only tell me. But if I say, were I going to Calgary, you know that there's more coming because that's a contrary to fact form of the verb. So we have mood, although it's very, very minimal. And then basically we have third person. Yeah, that's conditional, Rosemary. If we have third person, we basically have third person singular present and everything else. So you can say, I go, you go, she goes. I love, you love, it loves. I drive, you drive, he drives. And that's it. There's no distinction between persons anywhere else in the verb paradigm. In the plural, they drive, we drive, you drive, they drive. We drove, you drove, they drove. There's no other distinctions for person. So we do have a marker for person, but it's only for third person present singular. And then we also mark for participles. We've got present and past participles, loving and loved, and driving, or sorry, not diving, I should have said driving, driving and driven. And if you were reading the blogs, you'll know that that's how you shut people up on airplanes. You just tell them that they're using their participles wrong, and they'll stop. Actually, what you do is when you sit down, somebody in the airplane says, you're an English major, I better watch my grammar. Always say yes. And it totally shuts people down. I actually did, so I was told to do that once, and I did get one chance to do it in an airplane. Worked amazing. So our minimal set of distinctions is really different from Old English. So this is the Old English verb chart from our cheat sheet. And you can see they have a lot more. So first of all, actually I want to go one more because I did it in a different order. First of all, they have more inflectional paradigms than we do. We have weak and strong. And within strong, we do actually have we have different kinds of strong verbs, but we tend not to think of them that way, but we do. Old English has two different kinds of weak. They've got what we call weak 1 and weak 2. Within that one, weak 1, there's actually different strong and different kinds of weak 1 as well, but it's more phonological than because of an inflectional difference. But they've got weak 1 and weak 2, and they've got preterite, present. We'll talk about that when it comes up. But we've also got a whole bunch of strong verbs, as you can see here. 7 different classes of strong verbs. The difference between the A's and the B's and the C's is, again, phonological generally and predictable as a result, rather than the result of a different class. So they've got more inflections than we do, or more inflectional paradigms than we do. They also have real mood distinctions. They have the imperative, but they also really have a subjunctive. We've already seen Z, present subjunctive of the verb to be. You can see that they have, they don't just have a single person difference. They've got a whole person set. So if you look at singa, for example, in the present tense, you've got singa, singest, singeth, singoth. So they distinguish plural from singular, which we don't. And they distinguish first, second, and third person from each other, whereas we only distinguish third person present from everything else. They've got real mood, singa, singen. We have the imperative, as do they, of course. And then they've got, they've got the participles just like we do. So they got a full set. Now, something that you can see here as you look at it is they look a lot like Shakespeare's. And that's because Shakespeare still has this set. He hasn't got rid of it yet. So if you know from reading Shakespeare, if you remember how that sort of biblical archaic style sounds from the King James, the ending shouldn't be that weird to you, but they certainly have an awful lot more of them. And they also have the difference between strong and weak then, just like we do. They've got the ED in the weak verbs, or dental anyway, ED, OD, D. And in the plural, or sorry, in the strong verbs, they have it by changing sound. An interesting fact actually on the strong verbs, and I'm just going to throw it out there to whet your appetite, but I'm not going to explain much more about it, is how this arises. And this actually is connected to the fact that English, even in the, Germanic, is a root accented language. So Germanic is part of the Indo-European family, And not all languages in Indo-European stress the first syllable of words, but Germanic languages do. And the reason why we end up with strong verbs is because it's basically a fossilization of where the accent was said in Indo-European. I can follow this up with somebody if they're really interested in it. But remember how I said, if you ever want, if you're finding it hard to put the stress in the right place, make sure that you say the full quality of the vowel on the stress syllable and put schwa everywhere else. Well, that happened in Indo-European as well. And so what happened was, the reason why they're different vowel places is depending on where the stress was in Indo-European, you were close or far away from the full value of the vowel. And then when stress moved to the front syllable in Germanic, it fossilized that. Anyway, strong verbs are a feature of the Germanic language, and it's related to the fact that in Germanic, you stress the first syllable. It's really fascinating if you're ever interested in Germanic linguistics. As I said, they've got the weak, multiple weak paradigms, and they've also got the strong paradigms. They've got 7 different classes of strong verbs. And then they also have a couple of others. They've got some just irregular verbs like the verb to be, and they've got this thing known as preterite presence. There's a few of these. I don't know if I can think of one in modern English, but there's a couple of verbs in Old English where what they did was, they're so commonly used in the past tense that they basically reconstructed the paradigm using the past tense as if it was the present tense. And then they created like an additional past tense, and they used the past form of the verb. They're fascinating. There's a couple of them. Weton is one of them. There was a couple of other ones. That also shows up in other Indo-European languages. It's really very cool. And then the last thing to show you here about the verbs actually has to do with be to be. And it just came up today in the graduate class when we were reading this. This is a mistake that you're all going to make. So let me see if I can't flag that even harder. Pay attention, because you're going to mess this up. There are 2 forms of the verb to be. There's the yam and there's the beo. And you look down that irregular verb to be, and you'll see that basically there's 2 columns in the present. This isn't like Spanish, where they have 2 forms of the copula, one for identity purposes and one for just everything else. And it isn't, there's no difference in meaning between the eum art is sinned and beo bist bith beoth. There isn't any lexical difference between them. The mistake that you guys are going to make, and maybe we should just like charge you $1 every time you make this mistake, is when you see the form that begins with a B, you're going to translate it as B. So you're going to see, hey, bith, I don't know, sothful. He's truthful. And then what you're going to say is, he be truthful. And you're going to be wrong, and you're going to owe me $1, because it says he is truthful. But what's going to happen is, our be form, when you say that, when you say, you know, well, be he rich or be he poor, it has 2 different meanings in modern English, and neither of them are true of the Old English. So one use is be is actually the subjunctive form of the verb to be in sentences, slightly archaic sentences, like, you know, be he rich or be he poor. And then it also shows up as a way of introducing habitual action in African American dialects. And that's the version, you know, he be truthful is sort of touching on an African American style dialect. But in neither case are they doing it there. It's got nothing to do with habitualness. It's got nothing to do with subjunctiveness. It's just they have 2 forms of the verb to be. Okay? So let's see if this class can be the one that never does this. But I do think that what I'll probably do is, maybe I'll take 5% or $1 off of everybody. Every time you make the mistake, you surrender 5% or $1. And I think that's basically it. Yeah. Are there any questions about the verbs? The main thing to take away here is there's a lot, but we're already in our tutorial sections using the cheat sheet for this. I think if you've got that up and you recognize that it looks like more or less Renaissance English, just recognizing that there's a lot of cases or a lot of endings, and as a result, they should be telling you. I actually think it's a lot easier to read Old English in this regard than if somebody who spoke Old English had to read Modern English, because the Old English is telling you what the subject is using the endings. And that's why, at least in my tutorial, I don't think I said it last lecture, but in my tutorial, I've been really training people, when you're translating, find the inflected verb, the finite verb first, because those endings tell you a ton about what the subject is. It tells you if it's singular, it tells you what person it is, it tells you the mood and everything else. Okay, a question from Morgan, and just answered, will we learn how to use them? No. You just, yeah, exactly. As far as I'm aware, there is no difference. I think the variation is the same as thorn and F. It depends on probably maybe some dialectal or variation, but I'm not aware of there being any content variation. Any other questions? Okay, well, not hearing any, why don't we just turn to these texts that came from the chapter, and why don't we see about how some of these things are working? This is the reading passage. Did anybody do this already? This is from 4. This is the one from 4. Has anybody done this as part of their work? Everybody's going to be quiet because they're worried about me calling on them. No? Okay. I can spot, well, we'll do, here's what we'll do. Why don't we translate it? And I'll do that. And then what I'll do is ask how the use of the cases is going. All right? So, se hera thara Wikinga kom to Ashesduna on West Saxa. The army of the Vikings came to Ashesdun in West Saxon. The genitives is thara Wikinga. What kind of genitive is that? We don't need to know, if you study Latin, for example, you'll know it with the genitive of this or the dative of that. We don't need it in that regard. What is the general relationship when we're talking about basically possession, some kind of interest or origin is really habitual time, and partitive genitive is really the big ones. Anybody got an answer for me? Seher Thara Vikinga, the army of the Vikings. Somebody put a mic on. Anybody gonna try it?
I can try.
Sure, go for it.
Would that be the benefit? Because it's like the captain of the team, the army of the...
Yeah, I mean, so this is why whenever I teach, well, actually it's been, I shouldn't say whenever, because it's been 25 years since I did it. Whenever, the one time I taught Latin, I told people not to get too concerned about working that out, because you end up going down a rabbit hole with it if you're not careful. But yeah, you could do that. You could say it's a possessive though, right? It's the Vikings army in the sense of the captain of the team. Yeah, I mean, it becomes borderline, right? But yeah, it could be either of those, either possession or some kind of, I don't know, relational benefit of some kind.
Isn't it identity?
Sorry?
Isn't it identity more than possession? Because the Vikings do not possess that army. They are that army.
Yeah, I think, you know what, Barbara? I think that's better. And that was kind of where Em was going, right? Because she was thinking about the captain of the team.
Sure.
So yeah, some kind of identity, yeah. Unless you think of, I mean, is the Canadian Army our army?
Yeah, but it's not the same in this case, is it?
Well, no, because, unless he's thinking of the Viking homeland. I mean, if he's thinking of all the Vikings let's say he's thinking about the Viking people and their army. He's not. He's talking about a whole bunch of Vikings wandering around West Saxon. So yeah, I think you guys are right. Alfred Koning and Alfred Fast Koning's brother reden op en vochten with Sonahera. King Ethelred and Alfred, the brother of the king, rode up and fought with the army. All right, we've got a genitive, Fast Koning's brother. What do we want to think? I'm never sure about doing these ones because I got to say, I'm not sure they're hard. I'm not sure we actually don't introduce more confusion by doing this than by not doing it.
I mean, that's genitive singular, right?
Yeah. Okay, so genitive singular, the brother of the king, and what's it doing there? Like, why is it genitive?
Is it possessive, like it's his brother?
Well, we run into that same issue about what we had with the Viking army, right? You know what? I actually think that I think it might be in more trouble than it's worth. And in this entire passage, they don't have anything about cups of coffee, which is where it actually becomes important. You know what? Oh, wait, we do have one. We do. Okay, here's one. In the very last, second last line there, you've got and fewer fara erla, and 4 of the earls. What's that one?
It's a partitive.
It's the partitive, because you're talking out of all the earls in the world, he's got 4 of them. So there's an example of a partitive genitive. Yeah, as a rule, I'm not sure we need to do it because exactly the same thing shows up in modern English. Let me see if there's anything interesting in terms of, well, I'll just show you some other examples of just other case uses. So we've got with fauna hair. We've got with is the preposition. That's our modern English with. This is actually also going to come up in the next text. And with never means with in the sense of accompaniment. It never means, if you think about it for a second, come with me. They never use with that way. We use with in 2 different ways in modern English. We use with in the sense of, well, I can give you, I fought with her. Can mean 2 different things. It can mean that she was my colleague and we fought together, or it can mean I got in an argument against her. In Old English, it's always the second kind. And they fought with that army against that army. Let me find another one. There's a next one, on twam yefulkum, into, and I think that means like divisions or parts or something like that. And so there you've got a dative with a preposition, fought with, and then we've got to go over to hera, dative, army of the king, fought with hera thara erla, fought against the army of the king, and that's it. I think it's all pretty straightforward. Any questions? I see there's some chat about partitive genitive. Yeah, I always think of it that way too. It's a partition of the whole. The only thing to worry about is when you're talking about something, it's easiest with counts. So I got 4 of the marbles. It's a little bit more difficult for some people to see when you're talking about something that's not partable, when you're extracting it from like a cup of coffee. Okay, I'm not hearing anything. So to be honest, that was really it. We looked at the cases, the senses, the cases. All of those examples are things that we can do in modern English with them. The only one that we don't have is that, at least I'm not aware of it, is this sense of movement between the accusative, which is with a preposition meaning movement, as opposed to the dative. I actually have always found that counterintuitive. I don't know why, but I've always found it counterintuitive. But otherwise, all the uses of the genitive, all the uses of the nominative, all the uses of the dative are things that an accusative are things that we can do. And if there aren't any questions, I think we can call it there. And next class, you'll be in your new groups, beginning the life of Jesus. Okay, well, thanks. I'm going to hang on if anybody's got any questions, but otherwise, see my group on Wednesday.